very warm welcome, everyone, to this vital deep dive. It's brought to you by TCE. That's the NGO voice of the Turkish Cypriot people.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really digging into a critical and difficult period in Cypriot history, the 1963 crisis.
Absolutely pivotal.
And TCE has compiled some crucial resources for us. We've got a detailed historical report, a really moving personal narrative, a persuasive briefing laying out the Turkish Cypriot perspective, and also a clear chronological timeline.
A really solid set of materials to work from.
Our mission today, essentially, is to understand these events, 1963, from that Turkish Cypriot viewpoint. We want to look at how the power-sharing government broke down, and terrible violence that followed.
Yeah, we'll unpack the factors leading up to it and, what happened immediately after.
And just to say, if this history matters to you, please do visit TCExist.com. You can find out more there. And importantly, contact your political representatives. Make sure they hear this side of the story.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The Republic of Cyprus, founded in 1960, the idea was a bi-communal state, right? A partnership.
Between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, yeah.
Exactly. The Constitution set up a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president. And critically, both had veto powers.
So real checks and balances were built in.
Supposedly, yes. Turkish Cypriots were also guaranteed representation in parliament, the civil service, police, the army. It reflected their status as co-founders.
And there were treaties, too, to protect this setup.
Yes, the Treaties of Guarantee and Alliance, signed by Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, and the UK. They were meant to prevent anyone changing the constitution unilaterally and specifically banned both a gnosis union with Greece and taksim, or partition.
Okay. Sounds like a framework was there. But TCE's report mentions, well, not everyone was happy from the start.
That's right. There was a dissatisfaction on both sides, really. For many Greek Cypriots, the goal remained a gnosis, and these agreements felt like, well, obstacles.
And for Turkish Cypriots?
While the treaties offered protection, there was always this underlying worry about, long-term security and whether their equality would truly be respected.
Which seems prophetic, given what happened next. The report details escalating tensions.
And a real erosion of that power-sharing idea. TCE points to the Greek Cypriot leadership really driving this. Archbishop Makarios, his 1963 statement about creating a state but not a nation, that was a pretty clear signal, wasn't it?
Moving away from the partnership idea.
Definitely. And it wasn't just words. TCE's research highlights a disregard for the Constitution itself by Greek Cypriot officials. Makarios even suggested they might just ignore rulings from the Supreme Constitutional Court if they didn't like them.
And they actually did that, didn't they? The historical report mentions April 1963.
Yes. The Supreme Constitutional Court, which had a neutral German judge, Professor Forsthoff, as president, ruled against a Greek Cypriot initiative related to separate municipalities.
And the response?
The Greek Cypriot authorities simply defied the ruling. Just ignored it, which led Professor Forsthoff to resign. I mean, that's a massive blow to the rule of law.
Wow, so open defiance.
Pretty much. Even Greece's own foreign minister at the time apparently expressed alarm, warning against just ditching international agreements because they felt irksome.
So the stage was set for something more drastic.
Which brings us to November 1963 and the proposal of 13 specific constitutional amendments by the Greek Cypriot leadership.
And TCE's briefing stresses these weren't just minor changes.
Not at all. They were a direct assault on the core protections for Turkish Cypriots. 8 key provisions relating to their participation and rights were targeted for abolition or, major modification.
Like what specifically? What were they trying to change?
Well, crucial things. Removing the Turkish Cypriot vice president's veto power, that was a big one.
So removing that key check and balance we talked about.
Exactly. Also ending separate Turkish Cypriot municipal councils, which allowed them local control over their own community affairs, and significantly cutting the guaranteed percentage of Turkish Cypriots in the public service and police force.
Basically dismantling the power-sharing structure piece by piece.
That's certainly how the Turkish Cypriot leadership saw it. Vice President Dr. Fazal Kusuk rejected them outright. He said, and TCE quotes this, it was an attempt to reduce Turkish Cypriots to a mere minority, totally subordinate.
And Professor Forsthoff, the judge who resigned, what did he say later?
His assessment, cited by TCE, was blunt. He placed sole responsibility for the crisis on Makarios, saying his aim was to deprive the Turkish community of their rights. So the narrative that the Constitution was simply unworkable is challenged here. Forsthoff saw it as a deliberate political act.
And lurking behind these political moves, there was something darker, right? The Akritas plan.
Yes. This secret plan, drafted by elements within the Greek Cypriot leadership, TCE's briefing calls it a blueprint to basically weaken the Turkish Cypriots, get rid of the treaties, and achieve a gnosis unilaterally.
How do they plan to do that?
It apparently outlines stages. First, push for constitutional changes, like the 13 Amendments, to abolish the guarantees. Then, if Turkish Cypriots resisted, the plan allegedly called for neutralizing them quickly and forcefully, possibly with armed action, before Turkey or Britain could intervene.
That sounds incredibly calculated. Is there evidence connecting this plan to the leadership?
Well, TCE highlights testimony from a later Greek Cypriot militia leader, Lieutenant General George Karagiannis. He explicitly linked Makarios' actions in December 63 to the Akritas plan. He described it as and this is a direct quote highlighted by TCE, a blueprint for the annihilation of the Turkish Cypriots and the annexation of the island to Greece.
Annihilation.
Yeah.
It's chilling language.
It really is. It suggests this wasn't just about political dominance, but potentially something far more sinister.
Which leads us directly into the violence of December 1963, what's often called Bloody Christmas.
Yeah, the trigger, according to the historical report, was gunfire on December 20th or 21st in Nicosia, an incident between Greek Cypriot police and some Turkish Cypriots.
But it didn't stay localized.
No, tragically not. It escalated very quickly into what TCE describes as organized attacks on Turkish Cypriot neighborhoods, starting in Nicosia but then spreading across the island.
And TCE's report emphasizes this wasn't just random fighting.
No, the casualty figures alone are stark. By mid-1964, 364 Turkish Cypriots were confirmed killed. The number for Greek Cypriots in the same period, often in retaliatory actions or later clashes, was 174.
That's more than double.
It points to the initial asymmetry of the violence, and then there's the displacement. It's staggering. Around 25,000 Turkish Cypriots, that's roughly a quarter of their entire population at the time, were forced out of 104 different villages.
Forced into enclaves.
Yes, small defensible areas. Meanwhile, very few Greek Cypriots were displaced during this specific period of late 63, early 64.
The report includes eyewitness accounts, doesn't it? What did they describe?
They're harrowing. TCE has compiled accounts describing targeted destruction. Entire Turkish Cypriot villages or quarters burned down, while neighboring Greek Cypriot properties were often left completely untouched. It suggests, a deliberate campaign.
And the personal narrative essay TCE provided must bring this home too.
Oh, absolutely. It gives you that visceral sense, the sudden shock of gunfire, families grabbing what little they could and fleeing, the sheer terror of hearing about attacks on nearby villages, knowing you might be next. It really personalizes the statistics.
Were there specific incidents of extreme brutality documented?
Yes, tragically. TC's materials detail several horrific events. British journalists reported a massacre of potentially 200-300 people in a Turkish Cypriot area of Nicosia.
Good heavens.
Then there's the infamous Kumsal massacre in Nicosia. A Turkish Cypriot army major, a pediatrician, was on duty. His wife and 3 young children were murdered in their bathtub. That house is preserved today as the Museum of Barbarism.
That's just unimaginable.
And the Ios Vasilios massacre, where dozens of Turkish Cypriot villagers were later exhumed from a mass grave discovered by the UN. Massacres reported in Limassol, too. It wasn't isolated. TCE argues it was a pattern.
And beyond the killings, the destruction of property.
Immense. The report lists 103 villages where Turkish Cypriot property was partially or totally destroyed, thousands of homes ransacked, and significantly, the desecration of over 270 mosques, shrines, and other religious sites. It was an assault on their very presence.
So what was the world hearing about this at the time? What was the international reaction?
Well, TCE includes reports from major newspapers like The Guardian and the Daily Herald. They were reporting on the one-sided nature of the violence, the devastation in Turkish Cypriot areas. It wasn't entirely hidden.
Were there any admissions from the Greek Cypriot side?
Some voices, according to TCE's research, did acknowledge extremist elements planning and carrying out attacks. It wasn't universally denied even then.
In diplomatic channels, what were governments saying?
The report quotes a British High Commission telegram from the time. It's quite stark. It describes atrocities committed by Greek Cypriot police and expresses, frankly, a complete lack of faith in Archbishop Makarios' assurances that things were under control.
So London was aware of the severity.
Seems so. And TCE also cites an Italian journalist who observed what he called relentless Greek Cypriot terrorism. The picture emerging internationally, at least for those looking closely, was pretty grim for the Turkish Cypriots.
What did all this violence mean for the Turkish Cypriot role in the government?
It meant their effective expulsion. All Turkish Cypriot ministers, members of parliament, judges, civil servants, police officers, they were essentially removed from their posts.
How? Were they formally dismissed?
Not formally, no, it was de facto. They couldn't physically get to their offices safely. They faced threats, intimidation, or were simply blocked by irregular Greek Cypriot forces. It was impossible for them to function.
So they weren't boycotting, they were excluded.
That's the crucial point TCE emphasizes. It wasn't a voluntary withdrawal. And the Greek Cypriot administration then unilaterally filled these vacant positions, consolidating their control over the entire state apparatus. This was a clear violation of the 1960 Constitution's power-sharing arrangements.
Was this recognized internationally?
A later British parliamentary inquiry, cited by TCE, confirmed exactly this, that control of the government effectively passed solely to the Greek Cypriots during this crisis. And Turkish Cypriots found themselves shut out, not just domestically, but also from representing Cyprus internationally.
So you have violence, displacement, and now complete political exclusion. What was life like for those 25,000 displaced Turkish Cypriots?
Terrible. They were crowded into these small enclaves, geographically tiny areas, barely 3% of the island's total landmass. Remember, this was about a quarter of their entire population suddenly becoming refugees in their own country.
Did the UN document the conditions?
Yes. A UN investigation confirmed the scale of property destruction: over 500 Turkish Cypriot houses totally destroyed, 2,000 damaged across more than 100 villages. The UN Secretary General himself reported on the thousands fleeing their home.
You must have been a humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely. Severe shortages of everything: food, medicine, shelter, basic necessities. Life under siege, essentially.
How did the international community respond to this situation overall? There were the guarantor powers.
Well, a conference was held in London with Britain, Turkey, and Greece, but it failed to find a solution. The violence continued sporadically.
And the UN, they sent peacekeepers, right?
Yes, UNFICYP, the UN peacekeeping force, was deployed in March 1964 following Security Council Resolution 186. But that resolution itself is hugely controversial from the Turkish Cypriot perspective.
Why is that?
Because, as TCE's briefing strongly argues, Resolution 186 implicitly or explicitly recognized the now exclusively Greek Cypriot administration as the legitimate government of Cyprus.
Even though the Turkish Cypriot partners had been forcibly excluded.
Exactly. It essentially treated the situation as an internal matter for that government to handle, rather than addressing the collapse of the bicommunal state structure established in 1960. There was no real condemnation of the mass displacement of Turkish Cypriots.
That must have had huge consequences.
Profound. TCE argues it effectively legitimized the outcome of the violence and the coup against the constitutional order. The British representative to the UN at the time reportedly noted privately that the UN hadn't just failed to condemn the forcible usurpation, it had arguably rewarded it.
Did this encourage the Greek Cypriot side?
The Turkish Cypriot perspective is that it did. It gave the Greek Cypriot administration international standing, and TCE points out that the pursuit of a gnosis continued, for instance, with a symbolic vote for union with Greece in the Greek Cypriot parliament in 1967.
So, looking back at 1963 from the Turkish Cypriot perspective, how was it fundamentally understood? What's a core narrative presented by TCE?
It's seen unequivocally as a coup. A violent overthrow of the binational republic established in 1960. They argue the objectives laid out in the Akritas plan were largely achieved. The treaties and constitutional guarantees were nullified in practice. Turkish Cypriots were driven out of the government and state institutions, and the path was cleared for eventual Greek Cypriot domination, if not immediate enosis.
And they used strong language, ethnic cleansing campaign.
Yes, that's the term used in TCE's materials to describe the organized violence and mass displacement aimed at removing them from vast areas of the island and consolidating them into enclaves.
Is there external support for this view?
TCE points to findings like the 1987 British House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report, which concluded that the scale of destruction and displacement strongly suggested it was either directly inspired by or connived at by the Greek Cypriot leadership.
So for Turkish Cypriots, 1963 isn't just history, it's the root of present-day concerns.
Absolutely. TCE makes it clear that the trauma and injustice of 1963 directly inform the unwavering Turkish Cypriot insistence on effective security guarantees and genuine political equality in any potential future settlement. They see it as essential to prevent history repeating itself.
The personal narrative essay must really emphasize the human cost.
Immensely so. It moves beyond the political analysis to the lived experience. The sudden terror, the flight, witnessing atrocities like Kunsal, the daily struggle for survival in the besieged enclaves, the fear, the loss of loved ones, homes, livelihoods. It paints a picture of deep collective trauma.
A scar on the collective memory.
Exactly. And TCE uses it to underscore the determination that grew out of this suffering, a resolve never to be put in that position of vulnerability again.
And the persuasive briefing TCE provided, what's its core argument?
It brings all the threads together. It argues forcefully that 1963 wasn't spontaneous chaos, but a deliberate, orchestrated campaign. It lays out the evidence, the constitutional subversion, the Akritas plan, the documented violence and atrocities confirmed by international observers, the resulting humanitarian catastrophe and ethnic cleansing.
And it addresses the international response.
Yes. It critiques the UN's decision in Resolution 186 and the subsequent failure to hold anyone accountable for the violence against Turkish Cypriots. It frames the Turkish Cypriot actions defending themselves, forming their own administration in the enclaves as necessary acts of self-preservation against an existential threat.
What's the call to action in that briefing?
It calls for the international community to finally acknowledge the historical reality of 1963 from the Turkish Cypriot perspective, to recognize their suffering and the injustice done, arguing that this recognition is an essential first step if any genuine reconciliation is ever to be possible.
It's striking how consistent the narrative is across TCE's different materials, the report, the essay, the briefing, the timeline.
Yes, they all reinforce the same core understanding of the events. A systematic undermining of the 1960 agreements, culminating in a violent campaign that shattered the bicommunal republic and led to the long-term suffering and displacement of the Turkish Cypriot community. It's a powerful and disturbing picture they present.
Well, this deep dive into the 1963 crisis, brought to you by TCE, the NGO voice of the Turkish Cypriot people, has certainly shed light on a pivotal and, frankly, harrowing chapter in Cyprus's history.
It really has. The sources highlight the Turkish Cypriot experience of that time, the breakdown of power sharing, what they see as a premeditated plan enacted through violence, and the devastating consequences.
Understanding this perspective, this history, is just so crucial if you want to grasp the complexities of the Cyprus issue today, and why finding a just and lasting settlement remains such a challenge.
Absolutely essential context.
So we strongly encourage you, our listeners, to take action based on what you've heard. Please visit TCExist.com, that's TCExist.com, to learn more, to engage further with this vital history.
And importantly, reach out to your own political representatives. Make sure they are aware of this history, aware of the Turkish Cypriot perspective. Let them know this matters.
Your voice can make a difference. Thank you so much for joining us on this important deep dive today.
Thank you.
Until our next exploration, please keep visiting TCExist.com to learn more and find ways to ensure the Turkish Cypriot voice continues to be heard.